In the heavy heat of the night, a veteran cop drives to a lost farm in the middle of the woods, following an anonymous tip. Upon arriving, he finds a rusty gate and just ahead, a German shepherd chained to a thick chain. The animal suddenly breaks free, lunges, and sinks its teeth into the cop's jacket, pulling him inside the dark property. Inside, paw prints and scratch boxes indicate recent movement, but the silence is absolute. When the veteran forces open the barn door, armed men await him as if everything were planned. Immobilized, he is dragged to a cliff, hanging over the void, supported only by the dog holding his clothes. The criminals approach, the shepherd does not yield, and for a second, everything stops. Do you love stories with animals? So subscribe now and don't miss any. Thank you for following us. Now back to our story. The humid evening air clung to Jack Morrison's skin as he drove down the narrow dirt road that led away from Millbrook Township. At 62, the retired detective had thought his days of responding to mysterious calls were behind him. Yet here he was, gripping the steering wheel of his old pickup truck, following directions scrawled on a piece of paper that had been slipped under his door that morning. The anonymous note had been simple. Strange activities at the old Henderson farm. Something isn't right. They need help, but won't ask for it. No signature, no return address, just those cryptic words that had haunted Jack throughout his quiet retirement day. Jack had served the small Ohio community for 35 years, earning respect and trust from neighbors who still sought his advice, even though his badge had been retired for 3 years now. The Henderson farm had been abandoned for over a decade, ever since old Marcus Henderson had moved to the nursing home in the county seat. The property had fallen into disrepair, becoming a local eyesore that the township had been trying to deal with through proper legal channels. The headlights of his truck cut through the growing darkness as Jack navigated the winding road. Dense woods pressed in on both sides, their branches creating a canopy that blocked out most of the remaining daylight. He had driven this route many times during his active years, responding to calls about teenagers trespassing or reports of strange lights that usually turned out to be nothing more than reflections or wildlife. But something felt different tonight. Maybe it was the weight of retirement, the way quiet days had made him more sensitive to anything that disrupted the peaceful routine he had built. Or perhaps it was the careful handwriting on that note, suggesting someone who knew him well enough to trust him with their concerns, but didn't feel comfortable approaching him directly. As the truck rounded the final bend, the Henderson farm came into view. The old wooden fence that surrounded the property was weathered and sagging in places, but Jack noticed that the main gate, which he remembered being chained shut, now stood slightly ajar. A single light glowed from what used to be the main barn, casting long shadows across the overgrown yard. Jack parked his truck just outside the gate and stepped into the humid evening air. The sound of crickets filled the silence, but underneath their chorus, he could hear something else, the faint sound of machinery, like a generator running somewhere on the property. He approached the gate cautiously, not from fear, but from the habit of careful observation that had served him well throughout his career. The chain that had secured the gate lay on the ground, not cut or broken, but simply unhooked, as if someone with legitimate access had opened it. It was then that Jack noticed the dog. A magnificent German shepherd sat motionless near the entrance, its dark eyes reflecting the distant barn light. The animal was clearly well cared for, its coat thick and healthy, its posture alert but not aggressive. What struck Jack as odd was the heavy chain attached to a metal stake driven into the ground near the gate. The chain appeared to be connected to a collar around the dog's neck, but something about the setup seemed wrong. As Jack moved closer, the German shepherd rose to its feet. The animal didn't bark or show any signs of hostility, but instead tilted its head with an almost human-like expression of curiosity. Jack had always been good with dogs. His late wife Martha had insisted they always have at least two around the house, and this one seemed to recognize something trustworthy in his approach. "Easy there, boy," Jack said softly, extending his hand palm down for the dog to sniff. "What are you doing out here all alone?" The German Shepherd approached cautiously, and Jack could see that despite the heavy chain, the animal moved with surprising freedom. Upon closer inspection, he realized that the chain wasn't actually attached to the collar at all. It had been carefully positioned to create the illusion of restraint, but the dog was completely free to move around the property. This discovery sent a chill down Jack's spine. Someone had deliberately staged this scene, but why? And who was caring for this obviously healthy and well-trained animal on what was supposed to be an abandoned property? The dog seemed to sense Jack's confusion and began walking toward the barn, stopping every few steps to look back as if encouraging him to follow. The animal's behavior was so purposeful that Jack found himself trailing behind, his detective instincts awakening from their retirement slumber. As they approached the barn, Jack could see that the building had been recently maintained. While the exterior showed appropriate wear for an abandoned property, there were subtle signs of care: new hinges on the doors, fresh gravel in the driveway leading to the structure, and windows that were too clean for a building that had supposedly been empty for years. The generator sound grew louder as they neared the barn, and Jack could see light seeping through gaps in the wooden walls. Someone was definitely using this space, and they were taking great care to make their activities appear invisible from the main road. The German Shepherd stopped at the barn door and sat, looking up at Jack with an expression that seemed to say, "This is what you came to see." Jack reached for the door handle, his heart rate quickening despite himself. In all his years of law enforcement, he had learned to trust his instincts, and right now they were telling him that whatever lay beyond this door would change everything. The heavy wooden door creaked as Jack pushed it open, and warm light spilled out into the evening air. What he saw inside made him freeze in the doorway, his mind struggling to process the scene before him. The barn had been completely transformed into what appeared to be a sophisticated workshop. Tables lined the walls, covered with equipment that Jack didn't immediately recognize, but which clearly represented a significant investment. Computer monitors glowed softly in one corner, displaying what looked like architectural drawings or technical blueprints. The air smelled of sawdust, metal polish, and something else, a chemical odor that Jack couldn't quite identify. But it wasn't the workshop setup that stopped Jack in his tracks. It was the person hunched over one of the workbenches, so absorbed in their task that they hadn't noticed his entrance. Even from behind, even after 3 years of retirement, Jack would recognize those broad shoulders and that particular way of holding a pencil anywhere. The man working at the bench was Tom Bradley, his former partner and closest friend for over 15 years of their shared career. Tom Bradley, who had moved to Florida after his own retirement 2 years ago. Tom Bradley, who had sold his house in Millbrook and sworn he would never return to Ohio's harsh winters. Tom Bradley, who should have been 1,000 miles away, enjoying his pension and the warm beaches of the Gulf Coast. Jack's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The anonymous note, the staged scene with the dog, the sophisticated equipment, none of it was random. Someone had wanted him to find this place, to discover Tom working in secret on this abandoned farm. But why the secrecy, and what exactly was Tom working on that required such elaborate precautions? The German Shepherd brushed past Jack's legs and padded into the barn, his nails clicking softly on the concrete floor. The sound finally alerted Tom to their presence, and he turned around with a start, nearly dropping the technical drawing he had been studying. For a moment, the two former partners stared at each other across the transformed barn, years of friendship and shared experiences hanging between them like a bridge neither was sure they could still cross. "Hello, Jack," Tom said finally, his voice carrying a mixture of resignation and something that might have been relief. "I wondered when you'd find this place." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, punctuated only by the gentle hum of the generators and the soft panting of the German shepherd, who had positioned himself between the two men as if sensing the tension in the air. Tom Bradley looked older than Jack remembered, despite only 2 years having passed since their last meeting at Tom's retirement party. New lines creased his face, and his usually neat appearance seemed disheveled. The confident posture that had made him such an effective officer seemed diminished, replaced by something that looked almost like guilt. "Tom," Jack said carefully, stepping fully into the barn and letting the door close behind him, "what in the hell are you doing here? Everyone thinks you're living it up in Clearwater Beach." Tom set down his pencil and turned to face his former partner. Completely. Behind him, Jack could see the workbench was covered with detailed architectural drawings, what appeared to be engineering specifications, and several thick folders bulging with documentation. "It's complicated." "Jack," Tom replied, running a hand through his graying hair, "I wasn't sure you'd come if I asked you directly. That's why I had to get your attention another way. You sent the note." Jack moved closer, his detective instincts fully engaged now. "You set up this whole scene with the dog, made it look like the place was abandoned, when clearly you've been working here for months." The German shepherd padded over to Tom, who absent-mindedly scratched behind the animal's ears. "This is Rex," Tom said, avoiding Jack's direct question. "He's been my partner in this whole endeavor. Smart as hell and absolutely loyal. Found him at a rescue shelter in Columbus, and it was like he understood exactly what I needed him to do." Jack studied his former partner's face, reading the micro-expressions that years of working together had taught him to interpret. Tom was nervous, definitely hiding something significant, but Jack didn't sense any deception about his affection for the dog or the genuine relief in his voice at seeing a familiar face. "Partner in what endeavor exactly?" Jack gestured toward the sophisticated equipment surrounding them. "This setup must have cost a fortune. What kind of work are you doing out here that requires this level of secrecy?" Tom walked over to one of the computer monitors and touched the screen, bringing up what appeared to be a complex three-dimensional model of some kind of mechanical device. The image rotated slowly, revealing intricate internal components and precise measurements. "Do you remember the Morrison case?" Tom asked, using a name that made Jack's blood run cold. "Which Morrison case?" Jack replied, though he knew exactly which one Tom meant. There had only been one case significant enough to be referred to simply as the Morrison case between them. "Your nephew, Jimmy, the accident at the construction site 5 years ago." Jack felt his chest tighten. Jimmy Morrison had been his sister's only son, a bright 26-year-old engineer who had been inspecting a new building foundation when a supposedly secure support beam had failed. The resulting collapse had left Jimmy permanently paralyzed from the waist down, ending his career and devastating his family. The official investigation had concluded that the support beam failure was due to a manufacturing defect, a 1 in a million flaw that no one could have predicted or prevented. The construction company, the manufacturer, and the city had all settled out of court, providing Jimmy with enough money for medical care and rehabilitation. But nothing could give him back his mobility or his dreams. "What does Jimmy's accident have to do with any of this?" Jack asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer wouldn't be simple. Tom turned back to the computer screen, pulling up a different file that showed what appeared to be technical specifications for industrial support beams. 6 months after I retired, I was doing some consulting work for an insurance company. They asked me to review some old cases, just routine stuff, to make sure their settlements were appropriate. He paused, clicking through several screens of data. Jimmy's case came across my desk, and something bothered me about it. The official report said the beam had a manufacturing flaw. But when I looked at the actual test results, the numbers didn't add up. Jack moved closer to the screen, trying to make sense of the technical data Tom was showing him. Engineering specifications had never been his strong suit, but he could see that Tom had highlighted several sections in red, indicating discrepancies or problems. I started digging deeper, Tom continued, and the more I investigated, the more I realized that the beam failure wasn't random at all. The manufacturing specifications had been deliberately altered, but not by the manufacturer. What do you mean altered? Jack asked, a cold knot forming in his stomach. Someone with access to the construction project had modified the load-bearing calculations after the beams were tested and approved. The beams were manufactured correctly, but they were being asked to support more weight than they were designed to handle. Jack stared at the screen, trying to process what Tom was telling him. You're saying someone deliberately caused Jimmy's accident? Not deliberately, Tom said quickly. I don't think anyone intended for Jimmy to get hurt, but someone was cutting corners, probably trying to save money by using lighter-duty support beams than the building actually required. They altered the paperwork to make it look like the beams were rated for higher loads. The German Shepherd seemed to sense the rising tension in the room and moved to sit beside Jack, pressing his warm body against the retired detective's leg in a gesture of comfort. Why didn't you bring this to the authorities? Jack asked. If you had evidence of construction fraud, that's something the state attorney's office would want to investigate. Tom's expression darkened. I tried, Jack. I spent 3 months putting together a comprehensive report, documenting every discrepancy, every altered specification, every piece of evidence that pointed to deliberate fraud. I submitted it to the state attorney, the city building inspector, and the insurance commission. And nothing happened. My report was reviewed, filed away, and forgotten. The case was already settled. Everyone had moved on. And nobody wanted to reopen an investigation that might implicate city officials or major construction companies. Jack felt a surge of the old anger that had sometimes consumed him during his active years. The frustration of seeing justice delayed or denied by bureaucracy and politics. But something still didn't make sense. So you decided to conduct your own investigation. Out here in secret. Tom nodded toward another workbench, where Jack could see what appeared to be scale models of building structures, complete with miniature support beams and testing equipment. I realized that if I was going to prove what happened to Jimmy, I needed to understand exactly how the fraud was carried out. I needed to replicate the conditions of the original construction and demonstrate conclusively that the beam failure was predictable and preventable. Jack walked over to examine the scale models more closely. The level of detail was extraordinary. Every bolt, every joint, every stress point had been carefully reproduced. It was clear that Tom had been working on this project for months, possibly even years. This is incredible work, Tom, Jack said, genuine admiration in his voice. But why all the secrecy? Why not work with Jimmy directly, or with a lawyer who specializes in construction cases? Tom's face clouded over. Because the more I investigated, the more I realized how deep this goes. The altered specifications weren't just a simple case of cutting corners. Someone with significant influence and authority had to approve those changes. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Who? Jack asked, though he was beginning to fear the answer. Tom pulled out a thick folder from beneath a stack of blueprints and handed it to Jack. The label on the folder read, Municipal Building Authority, Internal, Correspondence. The person who signed off on the altered specifications, Tom said quietly, was city engineer Robert Hayes. Jack felt the blood drain from his face. Robert Hayes wasn't just any city official. He was Tom's brother-in-law, married to Tom's younger sister Carol for over 20 years. He was also a man Jack had known personally for decades, someone he had considered a friend and trusted community leader. Tom, Jack said slowly, are you telling me that your own brother-in-law was responsible for Jimmy's accident? Tom nodded grimly. And when I tried to present my evidence to the proper authorities, Robert made sure it disappeared into bureaucratic limbo. He's been covering up his involvement for 5 years, and he has enough influence to keep it covered up indefinitely. The German Shepherd looked up at both men, his intelligent eyes seeming to understand the gravity of what was being discussed. Jack sank into a nearby chair, the weight of this revelation settling over him like a heavy blanket. But why, Tom? Why would Robert risk everything to alter construction specifications? Money, Tom replied simply. The original specifications called for industrial-grade support beams that cost 3 times as much as the standard ones that were actually used. On a project that size, we're talking about saving hundreds of thousands of dollars. Jack looked around the transformed barn, seeing Tom's work with new eyes. This wasn't just a hobby or an intellectual exercise. It was a desperate attempt to find justice for Jimmy and to hold accountable the man whose greed had destroyed a young man's life. "So what's your plan?" Jack asked. "You can't stay hidden out here forever, and you can't take on the entire municipal government by yourself." Tom smiled for the first time since Jack had entered the barn, and for a moment, he looked like the confident partner Jack remembered. "That's where you come in, old friend. I need someone with your reputation and connections, someone Robert can't intimidate or buy off. I need someone who cares about Jimmy as much as I do." Jack felt a familiar stirring in his chest, the same feeling he had experienced countless times during his career when a case finally started to make sense and justice seemed within reach. But as he looked at his former partner, surrounded by months of painstaking research and preparation, Jack also realized that Tom had positioned himself in an incredibly dangerous situation. Not physically, but professionally and personally. Going up against Robert Hayes would mean taking on one of the most powerful men in the county, someone with the resources and connections to destroy both their reputations and their futures. Jack spent the next hour examining every detail of Tom's research, from the meticulously documented discrepancies in the construction specifications to the scale models that demonstrated exactly how the support beam failures had occurred. The more he studied the evidence, the more convinced he became that Tom had uncovered something significant, and the more troubled he became by the implications. Rex had settled himself on a worn blanket near the space heater, occasionally lifting his head to watch the 2 men work. The dog's presence was somehow comforting, a steady reminder that even in the midst of this complicated situation, there were simple loyalties that could be trusted. "This is solid work." "Tom," Jack said finally, closing the last folder of documentation, "you've built a compelling case that the specifications were altered, and that Robert had both the authority and the motive to make those changes. But proving it legally is going to be a different challenge entirely." Tom leaned against the workbench, exhaustion evident in his posture. "I know. That's why I've been working in secret for so long, trying to make the case ironclad before taking it public. But every month that passes, it becomes harder to get anyone to listen." "Have you talked to Jimmy about any of this?" Jack asked. "No," Tom replied quickly, then seemed to reconsider. "Well, not directly. I've visited him a few times since I supposedly moved to Florida, always making excuses about being back in town for various reasons. He's doing better than I expected, actually. Got married last year to a wonderful woman named Sarah, and they're talking about starting a family." Jack smiled despite the serious nature of their conversation. Jimmy had always been resilient even as a child. His sister Patricia had raised him to be strong and optimistic, qualities that had clearly served him well in adapting to his new circumstances. "But that's exactly why this matters so much," Tom continued, his voice growing more intense. "Jimmy deserves to know the truth about what happened to him. More importantly, he deserves to see the people responsible held accountable. The settlement money helped with his immediate needs, but it can't give him back his career or his mobility." Jack nodded, understanding the weight of what Tom was saying. Jimmy had been pursuing his master's degree in structural engineering when the accident occurred, with plans to work on major infrastructure projects. That dream had been taken from him by someone's greed and carelessness. "What's your timeline?" Jack asked. "How much more evidence do you need before you're ready to take this public?" Tom walked over to another workbench and picked up what appeared to be a formal report, bound in a blue cover with official-looking seals and signatures. "Actually, I'm closer than you might think. Last month, I finally got access to the original manufacturing specifications for those support beams, directly from the steel company that produced them." He opened the report and showed Jack a side-by-side comparison of the manufacturer's specifications and the documents that had been filed with the city building department. The differences were stark and unmistakable. Someone had systematically altered load-bearing ratings, stress tolerances, and safety margins throughout the entire project. "This proves beyond any doubt that the alterations were deliberate," Tom said. "These aren't clerical errors or simple mistakes. Someone with detailed engineering knowledge made calculated changes to save money, knowing full well that it would compromise the structural integrity of the building." Jack studied the documents carefully. His years in law enforcement had taught him to recognize evidence that would hold up in court, and what Tom had assembled was impressively thorough. But it also raised a troubling question. If you have all this evidence, why haven't you presented it to a private attorney? Someone who specializes in construction liability cases and isn't connected to the local political structure. Tom's expression grew troubled. "I tried that 6 months ago. I contacted 3 different law firms that handle major construction cases, thinking that the evidence was strong enough to justify reopening Jimmy's settlement. And the first firm reviewed my materials for 2 weeks, then suddenly decided they had a conflict of interest and couldn't take the case. The second firm was very interested initially, but after they conducted their own preliminary investigation, they called me and said they didn't think we could prove deliberate wrongdoing." Jack frowned. "What about the third firm?" "That's where things got really strange," Tom said, moving to yet another filing cabinet and pulling out a folder labeled Legal Correspondence. The third firm, Henderson and Associates out of Columbus, was very enthusiastic about the case. They said they thought we had grounds not just for reopening Jimmy's settlement, but for pursuing additional damages and possibly even criminal charges. "That sounds promising," Jack said, though Tom's tone suggested otherwise. "It was, until the senior partner called me 3 days later and said they were withdrawing from the case immediately. When I pressed him for an explanation, he got very uncomfortable and finally admitted that they had received a call from someone claiming to represent the city's legal department, warning them that pursuing this case could jeopardize their eligibility for future municipal contracts." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. What Tom was describing sounded like witness intimidation, or at least an attempt to discourage legal representation. It suggested that Robert Hayes was not only aware of Tom's investigation, but was actively working to suppress it. "Tom, if Robert is using his official position to interfere with your legal representation, that's a serious ethics violation at minimum. It could also be grounds for obstruction of justice charges." "I know," Tom replied grimly, "but proving that he made those calls, or that he was acting in an official capacity when he made them, is nearly impossible. He's smart enough to cover his tracks, and he has enough connections throughout the legal community to make life very difficult for anyone who challenges him." Rex stirred from his position by the heater and padded over to the barn door, his ears alert. A moment later, Jack could hear what had caught the dog's attention, the distant sound of a car engine approaching the farm. Both men froze, the reality of their clandestine meeting suddenly very apparent. Tom moved quickly to one of the computer monitors and began shutting down the equipment, while Jack instinctively positioned himself where he could see both the door and the windows. "Are you expecting anyone?" Jack asked in a low voice. "No," Tom replied, his hands moving efficiently over keyboards and power switches. The farmer who owns this place is supposed to be visiting his daughter in Cincinnati this week. No one else should know I'm here. The sound of the approaching vehicle grew louder, and through the small window, Jack could see headlights cutting through the darkness. The vehicle appeared to be moving slowly, as if the driver was unfamiliar with the property or searching for something specific. Rex had moved to a position between the two men and the door, his body language alert but not aggressive. The dog's training and intelligence were evident in the way he seemed to understand the need for caution without any verbal commands from Tom. "Could it be related to your investigation?" Jack asked. "Someone who might have figured out what you're working on." Tom finished shutting down the last of the equipment and moved to peer out the window alongside Jack. The vehicle had stopped near the farmhouse, about 50 yards from the barn, and they could see a figure getting out and walking toward the building with a flashlight. "I don't think so," Tom said, but his voice carried uncertainty. "I've been incredibly careful about my movements, and I've made sure that all my research materials are stored here rather than anywhere they might be discovered." As they watched, the figure with the flashlight began walking systematically around the farmhouse, shining the light through windows and examining the doors. The person appeared to be conducting some kind of inspection or search, but from their distance, it was impossible to tell if it was official business or something else entirely. "Maybe it's just a security check," Jack suggested. "The township has been talking about doing periodic inspections of abandoned properties, especially after that series of break-ins last spring." But even as he said it, Jack didn't believe it. The methodical nature of the search, combined with the timing of the visit just as he and Tom were meeting, felt like too much of a coincidence. The figure finished examining the farmhouse and began walking toward the barn, their flashlight beams sweeping back and forth across the ground. Rex had positioned himself directly in front of the door now, his ears pricked forward and his tail held low, a posture that suggested he was prepared to defend the space if necessary. "We need to get out of here," Tom whispered, moving toward what appeared to be a back door at the rear of the barn. "There's a path through the woods that leads to an old logging road. We can circle back to your truck once whoever this is finishes their inspection." But as Tom reached for the back door handle, Jack held up a hand to stop him. Something about the approaching figure's movements had triggered a memory, a familiar gait and posture that he recognized despite the darkness and distance. "Wait," Jack said quietly. "I think I know who that is." The figure was now close enough that their flashlight beam was beginning to illuminate the barn doors. Jack could see that it was indeed someone he recognized, Patricia Morrison, his sister and Jimmy's mother. "It's Patricia," Jack said, relief and confusion mixing in his voice. "My sister, but what is she doing here?" Tom stared at him in surprise. "Your sister? How could she possibly know about this place?" Before Jack could answer, Patricia's voice called out from just outside the barn door. "Jack, I know you're in there. Your truck is parked outside the gate, and I followed your tire tracks through the mud. We need to talk." Jack and Tom exchanged glances, both realizing that their secret investigation was no longer secret. Rex looked up at Tom questioningly, as if waiting for instructions on how to respond to this unexpected development. "I think our timeline just got accelerated," Jack said grimly, moving toward the barn door. "Patricia," he called out, "give us a minute to get things organized in here. Then we'll open the door." "I'm not going anywhere, Jack," came her reply. "And neither are you, until you explain to me why my brother and his former partner are conducting secret meetings at an abandoned farm instead of sitting on their front porches, enjoying their retirement like normal people." Jack looked back at Tom, who was rapidly collecting the most sensitive documents and securing them in a locked file cabinet. The careful secrecy they had maintained was about to end, and with it, their ability to control how and when their investigation became public knowledge. But perhaps, Jack thought as he reached for the door handle, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Patricia had every right to know what they had discovered about her son's accident, and she might be exactly the ally they needed to finally bring Robert Hayes to account for his actions. The question was whether she was prepared for the truth they were about to reveal, and whether that truth would bring justice for Jimmy or simply create new dangers for everyone involved. Jack opened the barn door to find his sister standing in the circle of light cast by the overhead fixture, her arms crossed and her expression a mixture of concern and determination that he recognized from their childhood. At 58, Patricia Morrison still carried herself with the same no-nonsense attitude that had made her an effective high school principal for over 20 years before her own retirement. "Hello, Patricia," Jack said, stepping aside to allow her into the barn. "This isn't exactly how I planned to spend my evening either." Patricia entered the transformed space, her eyes taking in the sophisticated equipment, the detailed architectural drawings, and Tom's research materials with the same careful observation skills that had made her such an effective educator. Rex approached her cautiously, but she extended her hand with the confidence of someone who had always been comfortable around animals. "Tom Bradley," she said, acknowledging Jack's former partner with a nod. "I thought you were supposed to be living in Florida, fishing and playing golf like a proper retiree." "Hello, Patricia," Tom replied, his discomfort evident. "I can explain why I'm here, but it's complicated." "I imagine it is," she said, moving closer to examine one of the workbenches covered with technical documents. "Complicated enough that my brother felt he needed to lie to me about where he was going tonight. And complicated enough that you've been secretly working in an abandoned barn for what appears to be months." Jack felt a familiar twinge of guilt. Even as children, Patricia had possessed an uncanny ability to detect when he was being less than truthful, and retirement clearly hadn't dulled that particular skill. "How did you know where to find us?" Jack asked. Patricia pulled out her cell phone and showed him a text message. "Because Robert Hayes called me 3 hours ago and told me that he was concerned about you. He said you'd been asking questions about Jimmy's accident, and that he was worried you might be getting involved in something that could cause problems for our family." The blood drained from Jack's face as the implications of Patricia's statement sank in. If Robert Hayes knew about Jack's involvement in Tom's investigation, then their secrecy had been compromised for much longer than they had realized. "Robert called you directly?" Tom asked, his voice tight with concern. "He did," Patricia replied, her attention still focused on the technical drawings spread across the workbench. "He was very polite and seemed genuinely concerned about Jack's well-being. He mentioned that you had been asking questions about construction specifications and building inspections related to Jimmy's accident." She looked up at both men, her expression growing more serious. "What Robert didn't realize is that his call confirmed something I've suspected for months. Jimmy hasn't been entirely truthful with me about his accident." Jack and Tom exchanged glances, both surprised by this revelation. "What do you mean?" Jack asked. Patricia moved to another workbench and picked up one of Tom's scale models, examining it carefully. "6 months ago, Jimmy came to visit me, and he seemed troubled about something. When I pressed him, he finally admitted that he had been having doubts about the official explanation for his accident." She set down the model and turned to face them directly. "He said that in the weeks before the accident, he had noticed several irregularities in the construction specifications, things that didn't match his engineering training or experience. But when he tried to discuss his concerns with the project supervisors, he was told that everything had been approved by the city engineer's office." Tom moved closer, his interest clearly piqued. "What kind of irregularities?" According to Jimmy, the support beam specifications seemed insufficient for the load requirements of the building design. He said it was like someone had calculated the structural requirements correctly, but then substituted lighter-duty materials without adjusting the rest of the design. Jack felt his pulse quicken. What Patricia was describing matched exactly what Tom had discovered through months of independent research. Did Jimmy document any of these concerns? Tom asked. That's what I came here to find out, Patricia replied, looking directly at Tom. Because 3 weeks ago, Jimmy told me that he had been contacted by someone claiming to be conducting an insurance review of his case. This person asked detailed questions about his recollections of the construction site, the specifications he had reviewed, and the concerns he had raised before the accident. Tom's face went pale. I never contacted Jimmy directly. I made a point of staying away from him because I didn't want to raise false hopes until I had solid evidence. Then who was asking him questions? Patricia asked. And why did Robert Hayes seem to know so much about your investigation when he called me tonight? The three of them stood in silence for a moment, the implications of Patricia's revelations settling over them like a heavy blanket. Rex seemed to sense the tension in the room and moved to position himself between the barn door and the group, his alert posture suggesting he was on guard for any new arrivals. There's something else, Patricia continued, reaching into her purse and pulling out a manila envelope. After Robert's call tonight, I went to Jimmy's house to ask him more questions about the insurance investigator who had contacted him. Jimmy gave me this. She handed the envelope to Jack, who opened it to find a series of photographs and what appeared to be photocopies of construction documents. The photographs showed the construction site where Jimmy's accident had occurred, but they were taken from angles and at times that weren't included in the official investigation file. Jimmy took these pictures? Jack asked. Yes, in the weeks before his accident. He said he was documenting the irregularities he had noticed, thinking that he might need to present his concerns to someone in authority if the project supervisors wouldn't listen to him. Tom moved to examine the photographs over Jack's shoulder, and his sharp intake of breath confirmed what Jack was beginning to suspect. The images showed clear evidence of the substandard materials that Tom had identified through his research, but more importantly, they were dated and time-stamped proof that the problems had been visible and documentable before the accident occurred. This changes everything, Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. These photographs prove that the structural problems were apparent to a trained engineer before the accident, which means they should have been apparent to anyone with similar qualifications who was responsible for inspecting the work. Including the city engineer, Jack added grimly. Patricia nodded. Jimmy was reluctant to give me these pictures because he said the insurance investigator had specifically asked about any documentation he might have from before the accident. He was afraid that if he turned them over to the wrong person, they might disappear. Who was this insurance investigator?
Tom asked.
Did Jimmy get a name or a company? He said the man identified himself as working for a firm called Consolidated Risk Management, and that he was conducting a routine review of old cases to ensure that settlements had been appropriate. He was very professional and seemed knowledgeable about construction engineering. Jack felt a cold chill as he processed this information. He had never heard of Consolidated Risk Management, and the timing of their contact with Jimmy was far too coincidental to be legitimate. I think we need to assume that Robert Hayes is much more aware of our investigation than we realized, Jack said, looking at Tom. And I think we need to assume that he's taking active steps to control the narrative. Tom nodded grimly. The question is, how much does he know, and what is he prepared to do to protect himself? There's another question, Patricia interjected. If Robert is trying to suppress evidence of his wrongdoing, and if he's using official resources to investigate and intimidate the people involved, then what we're dealing with goes beyond simple construction fraud. Jack understood what his sister was implying. If Robert Hayes was using his official position to cover up his role in Jimmy's accident, Then they were confronting not just engineering fraud, but abuse of public office and possibly obstruction of justice. "Patricia," Jack said carefully, "you need to understand that if we pursue this, it's going to get very complicated very quickly. Robert has significant influence in this community, and he's not going to go down without a fight. My son is living with the consequences of that man's greed and carelessness every single day." Patricia replied, her voice steady, but her eyes flashing with determination. "If you think I'm going to walk away from the truth because it might be inconvenient for Robert Hayes, then you don't know me very well." Rex moved closer to Patricia, as if sensing her resolve and offering his support. Tom looked at the dog and then at Patricia, and Jack could see his former partner making a decision. "All right," Tom said. "If we're going to do this, we need to do it right. No more secret meetings, no more half measures. We put together everything we have, we document it properly, and we take it to someone with the authority and independence to pursue it regardless of Robert's connections." "Who did you have in mind?" Jack asked. "The State Attorney General's office has a special unit that handles public corruption cases," Tom replied. "They have the resources and the jurisdiction to investigate a city engineer, and they're not subject to local political pressure." Patricia smiled for the first time since entering the barn. "I have a contact in the Attorney General's office, Margaret Chen, who used to be a prosecutor here in the county before she moved to the state level. She handled a case for the school district a few years ago, and I worked with her on the investigation. She's smart, thorough, and absolutely incorruptible. Can you trust her with something this sensitive?" Tom asked. "With my son's future at stake," Patricia replied. "Absolutely." Jack looked around the transformed barn, taking in the months of careful work that Tom had accomplished and the new evidence that Patricia had brought to light. For the first time since discovering Tom's secret investigation, he felt like they might actually have a chance of achieving justice for Jimmy. But he also knew that once they contacted the Attorney General's office, there would be no turning back. Robert Hayes would realize that his attempts to control the situation had failed, and he would likely become even more desperate in his efforts to protect himself. The next few days would determine whether their pursuit of truth would bring justice or simply create new dangers for everyone they cared about. The next morning brought unseasonably warm weather to Millbrook Township, as if nature itself was conspiring to make the day feel different from the ones that had preceded it. Jack arrived at Patricia's house at 7:30, finding her already dressed and ready, with a detailed folder containing copies of all the evidence they had gathered the night before. "I called Margaret Chen first thing this morning," Patricia reported as they climbed into Jack's truck. "She's agreed to meet with us at the State Attorney General's regional office in Springfield at 2 o'clock this afternoon." "What did you tell her about the case?" Jack asked as they drove through the quiet residential streets of his neighborhood. "Just that we had uncovered evidence of possible construction fraud and official misconduct related to a personal injury case from 5 years ago. I didn't want to give too many details over the phone, but I emphasized that we had documentation and that it involved a current city official." Jack nodded, appreciating his sister's discretion. Phone calls to government offices were often monitored or recorded, and they couldn't afford to have Robert Hayes learn about their meeting with the Attorney General's office before they had a chance to present their case properly. They drove to the Henderson farm to collect Tom and his research materials, but as they approached the property, Jack noticed something that made him slow the truck to a crawl. "What is it?" Patricia asked, following his gaze toward the farmhouse. "There's a car parked behind the barn," Jack replied, pulling over to the side of the road about 100 yards from the farm entrance. A dark sedan that wasn't there last night. Through the morning mist, they could see the outline of an official-looking vehicle with what appeared to be government plates. Jack pulled out a pair of binoculars that he kept in his glove compartment and focused them on the sedan. It's a city vehicle, he said grimly. Building Inspector's Department, if I'm reading the markings correctly. Patricia's face tightened with concern. Do you think Robert sent someone to investigate the barn? Or to destroy evidence? Jack replied, handing her the binoculars so she could see for herself. As they watched, two figures emerged from the barn and walked toward the sedan. Even at a distance, Jack could recognize the official bearing and purposeful movements of city employees conducting some kind of inspection or investigation. We need to get Tom out of there, Patricia said, lowering the binoculars. But before Jack could respond, his cell phone rang. The caller ID showed Tom's number, and Jack answered immediately. Tom, are you all right? Jack, thank God. Tom's voice was tense but controlled. I need you to listen carefully and don't interrupt. I'm fine, but we have a problem. 2 city building inspectors arrived here about an hour ago with a warrant to search the property for code violations. Jack felt his stomach tighten. What kind of warrant? They say there have been complaints about unpermitted electrical work and potential fire hazards in the barn. They have the right to inspect the entire structure and any equipment that might pose a safety risk. Can they do that without notice to the property owner? According to them, emergency safety inspections don't require advance notice. They've already been through most of my equipment, and they're taking photographs of everything. Patricia leaned closer to the phone so she could hear Tom's side of the conversation. What about your research materials? Nark asked. That's the strange part, Tom replied. They haven't touched any of the documents or files. They seem to be focused exclusively on the electrical setup and the computer equipment. But Jack, one of the inspectors, asked me specifically about unauthorized investigation, activities, and whether I had been using city resources or accessing city databases from this location. Jack and Patricia exchanged worried glances. The question about investigation activities suggested that the inspectors knew exactly what Tom had been working on, and that their visit was more about intelligence gathering than genuine safety concerns. Tom, I want you to get out of there as soon as they're finished, Jack said. Don't go back to your apartment, and don't go anywhere predictable. Can you meet us somewhere safe? Where do you want to meet? Jack thought quickly, trying to identify a location where they could talk privately without risking discovery. Do you remember the old Quarry Road where we used to meet informants during the Richardson investigation? Of course. I can be there in an hour, assuming these inspectors finish up soon. Good. And Tom, make sure you bring Rex with you. I have a feeling he's going to be important. After ending the call, Jack and Patricia sat in silence for a moment, watching the city inspectors complete their work at the barn. The implications of what was happening were becoming clearer, and none of them were encouraging. Robert's moving faster than we expected, Patricia said finally. He's not just trying to suppress our investigation, he's actively trying to dismantle Tom's research operation. The question is, how much did those inspectors actually discover? Jack replied. And what is Robert planning to do with whatever information they gathered? An hour later, they met Tom at the abandoned Quarry Road, a remote location that had provided privacy for sensitive conversations during Jack's active years as a detective. Tom arrived with Rex in the passenger seat of his pickup truck, and both man and dog looked shaken by their morning encounter with the city inspectors. They were very thorough, Tom reported as they gathered near Jack's truck. They photographed every piece of equipment, made detailed notes about the electrical setup, and asked a lot of questions about how long I'd been using the space and who had given me permission to be there. Did they find your locked file cabinets? Patricia asked. They didn't even try to open them. Like I said on the phone, they seemed completely uninterested in any documents or research materials. But they were very interested in my computer equipment and whether I had been accessing the internet from the barn. Jack frowned. That's strange. If they were trying to discover what you've been working on, you'd think they'd be more interested in your research than your internet connection. Unless... Patricia said slowly. They already know what he's been working on, and they're trying to establish that he obtained his information through unauthorized means. What do you mean? Tom asked. Think about it, Patricia continued. If Robert wants to discredit your investigation, the easiest way would be to claim that you obtained confidential city documents illegally. If he can prove that you were accessing city databases from an unauthorized location, he can dismiss all of your evidence as the product of criminal activity. Jack felt a chill as he realized what his sister was suggesting. It would be the perfect defense. Even if your research is accurate, Robert could claim that it's inadmissible because it was obtained through illegal means. Tom's face went pale. But I never accessed any city databases from the barn. All of my information came from public records requests, Freedom of Information Act filings, and direct contact with the steel manufacturer. Can you prove that? Patricia asked. Tom was quiet for a long moment, and Jack could see him mentally reviewing his research methods. Rex seemed to sense his human's distress and moved closer, pressing his warm body against Tom's leg. Most of it, yes, Tom said finally. I kept detailed records of all my information sources, but there were a few times when I used my old police department login to access archived case files that might not have been available through normal public records requests. Jack closed his eyes, understanding immediately what Tom was admitting. Tom, please tell me you didn't access those files from the barn. No, I was careful about that. I only accessed the police databases from my apartment using my personal internet connection. But if the city inspectors found evidence that I was using the internet from the barn for any official business, Robert could claim that I was conducting unauthorized investigations using city resources. Even if that's not true, Patricia asked. The truth might not matter, Jack replied grimly. If Robert can raise questions about the legality of Tom's information gathering, he can delay any official investigation indefinitely while those questions are resolved. As they talked, Jack noticed that Rex had moved away from the group and was standing at the edge of the quarry road, his ears pricked forward and his body alert. The dog was staring back toward the main road, his posture suggesting that he had detected something that concerned him. Rex is hearing something, Tom said, following Jack's gaze toward the dog. A moment later, they could all hear what had caught Rex's attention, the sound of vehicles approaching on the main road, moving slowly as if the drivers were searching for something specific. Jack moved to where he could see the road through the trees, and his heart sank as he identified the approaching vehicles. Two police cruisers and what appeared to be an unmarked sedan were driving slowly along the road, clearly conducting some kind of search or patrol. We need to leave, Jack said urgently. Now! But as they turned toward their vehicles, Jack realized that the approaching police cars weren't the only problem they faced. From the opposite direction, he could hear another vehicle approaching on the quarry road itself, effectively trapping them between two groups of official vehicles. The old logging trail, Tom said, pointing toward a barely visible path that led deeper into the woods. It connects to the county highway about 2 miles from here, but we'll have to go on foot. Patricia looked at the steep, overgrown trail and then at her business attire. I'm not exactly dressed for hiking through the woods. It's either that or explain to Robert Hayes why we were having a secret meeting at an abandoned quarry, Jack replied. Rex had already started toward the logging trail, as if understanding that retreat was their only option. Tom grabbed the most essential documents from his truck, along with a backpack that apparently contained emergency supplies. As they started down the logging trail, Jack could hear the police vehicles reaching the quarry road behind them. Whatever Robert Hayes had planned, it was clear that he was no longer content to work behind the scenes. The investigation had moved from a battle of evidence to something much more dangerous, a direct confrontation between people who had very different ideas about what constituted justice. The thick canopy of trees provided cover as they made their way along the overgrown trail. But Jack knew that their escape was only temporary. Robert Hayes had demonstrated that he was willing to use official resources to pursue them, and he had the authority and connections to make their lives very difficult. The question now was whether they could reach Margaret Chen and the Attorney General's office before Robert could completely discredit their investigation or find some way to silence them permanently. As they stumbled through the underbrush with Rex leading the way, Jack realized that the stakes had just increased dramatically, and that their pursuit of justice for Jimmy might end up costing all of them far more than they had anticipated. The logging trail was more treacherous than Jack had remembered, with fallen branches and hidden roots that threatened to trip them at every step. Patricia had gamely kept pace despite her inappropriate footwear, while Rex moved ahead of the group with the confidence of an animal who understood exactly where he was leading them. After 40 minutes of difficult hiking, they emerged from the woods near the county highway, sweaty and disheveled, but safely away from the police search. Tom's pickup truck was still back at the quarry, but Jack's vehicle had been parked at a different location, and they were able to retrieve it without incident. "We can't go to Springfield now," Patricia said as they climbed into Jack's truck. "If Robert has police looking for us, they'll be monitoring the highways and government buildings. But we can't wait much longer," Tom replied, clutching his backpack of essential documents. "Every day we delay gives Robert more time to destroy evidence or create new obstacles." Jack started the truck and pulled onto the highway, his mind racing through possible alternatives. As they drove, his cell phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. Jack Morrison. "This is Margaret Chen from the Attorney General's office. Patricia Morrison was supposed to meet with me this afternoon, but she never arrived and isn't answering her phone. Is everything all right?" Jack put the call on speaker so the others could hear. "Ms. Chen, this is going to sound unusual, but we've encountered some complications. The city official we wanted to discuss with you has apparently learned about our investigation and is taking steps to interfere with our ability to present evidence." There was a pause, and when Margaret Chen spoke again, her voice carried the sharp focus of an experienced prosecutor. "Mr. Morrison, are you saying that a city official is using official resources to obstruct a potential investigation?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Jack replied. "And I think we need to meet somewhere other than your office, at least initially." "That's highly irregular," Chen said, but her tone suggested she was intrigued rather than dismissive. "What kind of evidence are we discussing?" Patricia leaned toward the phone. "Margaret, it's Patricia. We have documentary evidence of construction fraud that resulted in a serious accident 5 years ago, along with proof that the responsible official has been actively covering up his involvement and interfering with legal representation." Another pause, longer this time. "Patricia, if what you're describing is accurate, this could be a significant public corruption case. But I need to see the evidence before I can make any official recommendations." "Where can we meet safely?" Jack asked. "There's a coffee shop in Riverside about 20 minutes from your location. It's public enough that you shouldn't feel unsafe, but private enough that we can review documents without attracting attention. Can you be there in an hour?" An hour later, they sat in a corner booth of Murphy's Coffee House, with Margaret Chen reviewing the evidence they had assembled. She was a compact woman in her early 40s, with steel-gray hair and the kind of intense focus that made her seem much larger than her physical presence suggested. Rex lay quietly under the table, having been welcomed by the dog-friendly establishment. Several other customers had remarked on the beautiful German Shepherd, not knowing that he had been instrumental in uncovering one of the most significant cases of municipal corruption the county had seen in decades. "This is extraordinary work," Chen said finally, closing the last folder of documentation. "Mr. Bradley, your research is thorough and your methodology is sound. These photographs that Jimmy took before his accident are particularly compelling evidence. So you think we have a case?" Tom asked. "I think you have much more than a case," Chen replied. "What you've documented is a clear pattern of deliberate fraud, followed by systematic obstruction of justice. The fact that Mr. Hayes has been using official resources to interfere with your investigation actually strengthens the case against him. Jack felt a surge of relief, but Chen's expression remained serious. However, she continued, we need to move very carefully from this point forward. If Robert Hayes realizes that we're preparing formal charges, he might take desperate steps to protect himself. What kind of steps? Patricia asked. Document destruction, witness intimidation, or using his official position to create legal complications that could delay prosecution. We need to secure all the physical evidence and get formal statements from key witnesses before he has a chance to interfere further. As if summoned by their conversation, Jack's phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed Robert Hayes' name. Don't answer it, Chen said immediately. In fact, I want all of you to turn off your phones right now. From this moment forward, all communication related to this case goes through my office. But before Jack could power down his phone, it rang again with a different number. This time, the caller ID showed Jimmy Morrison's name. That's my son, Patricia said urgently. Something might be wrong. Jack looked at Chen, who nodded reluctantly. Answer it, but be very careful what you say, Uncle Jack. Jimmy's voice was tight with anxiety. Thank God I reached you. I've been trying to call Mom, but her phone goes straight to voicemail. What's wrong, Jimmy? Robert Hayes just left my house. He came by about an hour ago, saying he had heard that someone was asking questions about my accident and that he was concerned about people taking advantage of me. Jack's blood went cold. What did he want? He asked me a lot of questions about the insurance investigator who contacted me and about the photographs I took before the accident. Uncle Jack, he knew about those photographs. He knew details that I never told anyone except Mom. Patricia grabbed Jack's arm, her face pale with worry and anger. What did you tell him? Jack asked. I told him I didn't know what he was talking about, but I don't think he believed me. He got very insistent, saying that if someone was misleading me about my accident, it could jeopardize my settlement and cause legal problems for our whole family. Chen was taking notes rapidly, her expression growing more grim with each detail Jimmy provided. He also said something strange when he was leaving, Jimmy continued. He told me that sometimes people think they're helping, but they're actually putting their loved ones in danger. He said I should be very careful about who I trust and what information I share. Jimmy, listen to me carefully, Jack said. I want you to pack a bag and go stay with your cousin in Columbus for a few days. Don't go to work. Don't follow your normal routine, and don't tell anyone except Sarah where you're going. Uncle Jack, you're scaring me. What's going on? Jack looked at Chen, who nodded encouragingly. Jimmy, we've uncovered evidence that your accident wasn't caused by a manufacturing defect like we were told. We think someone deliberately used substandard materials to save money, and that same person has been covering it up for 5 years. There was silence on the phone for a long moment. When Jimmy spoke again, his voice was steady but filled with emotion. Are you talking about Robert Hayes? What makes you ask that? Patricia said, leaning toward the phone. Because 5 years ago I tried to report my concerns about the construction specifications to the city engineer's office. I called 3 times and left detailed messages, but I never got a response. A week later I had my accident. The revelation hit Jack like a physical blow. Jimmy had tried to report the safety problems directly to Robert Hayes before the accident occurred. Robert hadn't just covered up his role afterward. He had ignored direct warnings that could have prevented Jimmy's injury entirely. Chen was writing furiously, and Jack could see that this new information had transformed their case from construction fraud to something much more serious. Jimmy, Chen said, identifying herself and explaining her role. I need you to document everything you remember about those phone calls to the city engineer's office. Dates, times, the specific concerns you reported, and any follow-up communication you attempted. I can do that, Jimmy replied. I actually kept copies of the written reports I prepared after each phone call. I thought I might need them if there were problems with the construction. Where are those reports now? Chen asked. In my home office. But if Robert Hayes is trying to suppress evidence, should I be worried about him coming back? Yes, Chen said without hesitation. Mr. Morrison, I want you to gather those documents immediately and bring them to the Attorney General's office in Springfield. We'll provide protection and ensure that your evidence is preserved. After ending the call with Jimmy, the four of them sat in silence for a moment, processing the full scope of what they had uncovered. Robert Hayes hadn't just committed construction fraud. He had ignored direct warnings that could have prevented a life-changing accident, then spent 5 years covering up his negligence and actively obstructing efforts to discover the truth. This changes everything, Chen said finally. We're no longer talking about a financial fraud case. We're talking about criminal negligence, obstruction of justice, and abuse of public office. What happens now? Tom asked. Now we move fast, Chen replied, already reaching for her phone. I'm calling my supervisor to request an emergency investigation team. We need to secure all physical evidence, interview witnesses, and prepare arrest warrants before Robert Hayes realizes how much trouble he's in. As Chen made her calls, Jack looked around the coffee shop where their secret had finally become an official investigation. Other customers were enjoying their afternoon coffee, unaware that at the corner table, justice was finally being set in motion for a young man who had waited 5 years to learn the truth about the accident that had changed his life. Rex stirred under the table and looked up at Tom with what seemed like satisfaction. The loyal German Shepherd had played his part in uncovering the truth, guiding them through the most dangerous moments and providing the steady companionship that had kept Tom focused during months of solitary investigation. 2 weeks later, Jack sat in his living room reading the newspaper headlines that announced Robert Hayes' arrest on charges of criminal negligence, obstruction of justice, and abuse of public office. The investigation had moved quickly once the Attorney General's office had become involved, and additional evidence had emerged that suggested Robert's fraud had extended to other construction projects throughout the county. Jimmy had received a formal apology from the city and a significantly larger settlement that would provide for his long-term care and enable him to complete his graduate degree in engineering. More importantly, he had received the truth about what had happened to him, and the satisfaction of knowing that the person responsible would be held accountable. Patricia knocked on Jack's door as he was finishing the article, carrying a basket of homemade cookies and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had seen justice finally served. "Have you heard from Tom lately?" she asked, settling into his kitchen with the familiarity of a sister who knew she was always welcome. "He called yesterday from the real Florida," Jack replied with a smile. "He said he's actually going to retire this time, though he's thinking about doing some consulting work for construction safety advocacy groups." "And Rex?" "Loving the beach, according to Tom. Apparently he's become quite the swimmer." Patricia laughed, then grew more serious. "You know, Jack, I've been thinking about everything that happened. If you and Tom hadn't been willing to pursue the truth, Robert Hayes would have gotten away with what he did to Jimmy." Jack nodded, but his expression was thoughtful rather than triumphant. "It makes you wonder how many other cases like this are out there. Situations where people in positions of trust abuse that trust and think they'll never be held accountable." "Maybe," Patricia said, "but it also shows that sometimes the truth finds a way to surface, especially when people are willing to take risks to uncover it." As they talked, Jack found himself thinking about the unlikely chain of events that had led to justice for Jimmy. An anonymous note, a secret investigation, a loyal dog, and the courage of people who refused to accept that some wrongs could never be righted. The story of Jimmy Morrison's accident and the corruption that had caused it had become front-page news throughout Ohio, inspiring other families to question official explanations that had never quite made sense. The Attorney General's office had established a special unit to investigate construction fraud and municipal corruption, with Margaret Chen leading the effort. But for Jack, the real victory wasn't in the headlines or the criminal convictions. It was in the phone call he had received from Jimmy the night before, filled with excitement about his plans to return to school and his determination to become the kind of engineer who would never let financial considerations override safety requirements. As Patricia prepared to leave, she paused at the door with a smile that reminded Jack of their childhood. "You know, this whole experience has reminded me why I was always proud to have a detective for a brother. You never could let an injustice stand, even in retirement." After she left, Jack sat on his front porch, watching the sunset and thinking about the strange turns that life could take. He had thought his days of pursuing justice were behind him, but sometimes the most important cases were the ones that found you when you weren't looking for them. The story of their investigation had touched people throughout the community and beyond, reminding everyone that ordinary citizens had the power to uncover truth and demand accountability from those in positions of authority. It was a message that resonated far beyond the boundaries of Millbrook Township, inspiring others to question, investigate, and never accept that justice was impossible to achieve. For those who had followed this remarkable story of courage, loyalty, and the pursuit of truth, it served as a powerful reminder that sometimes the most unlikely heroes, a retired detective, a determined sister, a dedicated former partner, and a faithful German shepherd, could change the course of history simply by refusing to give up on what was right. Dear friends, we hope the story of Jack, Patricia, Tom, and Jimmy has moved you deeply. This tale of courage, determination, and the pursuit of justice reminds us that truth has a way of surfacing when good people refuse to accept injustice. If you found yourself captivated by this story of family loyalty and the fight against corruption, we have prepared a special playlist filled with equally compelling narratives that explore the complex relationships between truth, power, and personal courage. You can find this collection by clicking the link to your left. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique stories that delve into the complexities of human nature and the triumph of good over corruption. Don't miss our upcoming content, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement helps us continue sharing these powerful stories of hope and justice.